So here we are continuing with our Venus 175 movement, and we're going to start now with the chronograph mechanism. And here is the pillar wheel, and I'm just applying a little bit of D5 to the bottom plate where the pillar wheel makes contact. So the pillar wheel just rests here. And I'm applying some grease at 9501, and this is to the inside shoulder of the pillar wheel. Now this is the shoulder screw for the pillar wheel. And so the ratchet teeth around the pillar wheel require lubrication, and for this I'm using 9501 grease. And that done, I can replace the spring for the pillar wheel, and if you remember, I replaced the screw for the spring back in the movement prior to cleaning, and this ensures that I'm using the correct screw on reassembly. It's a handy little time saver. Now I'm using some brass tweezers. What I want to do is just test to make sure that it's nice and smooth, and also to run in the grease around the teeth of the wheels. Around the teeth of the pillar wheel. I'm also checking to make sure that there's no excess side shake on the pillar wheel. And so now back on with this chronograph assembly bridge, which is secured by 2 screws. So we have the minute recording wheel. Now we don't lubricate the pivot on the minute recording wheel. The idea is that the oil will cause too much friction, and there is very little power pushing over the minute recording wheel. As you can see, the tension on the spring is very weak, and it wouldn't take a lot to stop it. So it's recommended not to oil it at all. So I'm applying a bit of 9010 on the chronograph runner tension spring. And of course, now I can install the chronograph runner, and I'm using 9010 on the chronograph runner, the pivot. And of course, here's the cock, which holds the two wheels in position. So as you can see, as I'm pressing down, I'm continuously making sure that the pivots are located in the holes. The last thing we want is accidents. Now I'm satisfied that everything's in place. I can secure the cock with the screw. Now as I'm screwing down, I'm also making sure that I'm keeping tension down on the cock with the pegwood here. This is because sometimes when you're screwing, the cock has a tendency to move about, and this can actually cause, or potentially cause, one of the pivots to break. So I'm finishing up here with the 9010 oil on the chronograph runner pivot only, and as mentioned before, I'm not oiling the pivot on the minute recording wheel. So this is a dual purpose spring for the chronograph runner rest and the sliding gear. So I'm just removing that so that I can first of all fit the sliding gear. And I first need to lubricate the post which the sliding gear fits over, and for that I've used D5. This is where the spring will act against, and so I'm using some grease, some 9501, and now I can refit the spring. Again, the pivots on the sliding gear, because there's so little power, it's not recommended to oil. And so we have the chronograph run at rest, and what I'm going to do is just refit that, and this is where to place some grease, because that's where the spring is going to act upon. I'm just lining up the hole, and before I apply tension on the spring, I'm going to screw it in place. Okay, I've applied a bit of D5 there, just for some lubrication on the pivoting point of the rest. Now I've slackened that off just slightly so that I can apply the tension of the spring. And now I can screw the rest all the way home. And so here we have the coupling clutch, and we need to oil this with Mobius 9010. We're going to oil both pivots. And I'm using a blower just to make sure that it's spinning freely. And so now I can fit this onto the movement. Now the coupling clutch pivots on an eccentric. So first I'm going to remove the screw. If you remember, I kept them in place whilst cleaning so that they didn't get mixed up. This screw is a little enthusiastic. And so this is the eccentric, and it looks like a screw, but it's not a screw. It governs the pitch between the coupling clutch, the wheel, and the wheel that sits on the fourth wheel extended pivot. And I'm applying some D5. I can refit the shouldered screw. So this is another eccentric where my tweezers were there, and that governs the pitch between the coupling clutch wheel and the chronograph runner. So now we can refit the driving wheel, which, as I said before, sits on the extended pivot of the fourth wheel. And for this we're going to need to use a staking set. I'm using a brass stake with a flat-headed punch. I'm not going to use a hammer, of course. All I'm using is the tool to allow me to drive the wheel home flat. So the last thing I want is for the fourth wheel pivot to break, which would be very easy to do if I just used, for example, a hand fitting tool. So I'm being very careful to keep the movement steady and flat whilst I press the wheel in place. I'm applying very little pressure when I'm pressing this wheel down, and I'm checking the teeth are in alignment with the coupling clutch wheel. As you can see here, the teeth need to be the same height as the coupling clutch wheel. So we need to go a little bit further. It's not quite driven home yet. And so now I have the wheel driven home. I'm just going to test it for free running. So I'm just applying a little bit of pressure onto the mainspring using the winder. What I'm looking for is any jerkiness, of which there isn't any here, so it looks like we're in business. So now that that's in place, I'm going to remove the coupling clutch until later. So now I'm going to reinstall the flyback mechanism, or part of the flyback mechanism. And first of all, if you remember, I left some screws in place, and so I'm just removing that first. So I'm applying a little bit of grease to the end of this spring. And so this part retains the flyback hammer and pivots on a shouldered screw. So I'm applying a little D5 at the pivoting point for the shouldered screw. And so now on with the operating lever for the flyback mechanism. And in all cases here I'm using Mobius 9501 grease. So here we have the hammer, and as you may have seen, I oiled the pivoting point with, I've used D5 there. So I'm just checking that the hammer is fully home. Where my tweezers are pointing, this is the place where the spring is going to rest upon, between those two, inside that recess there. And so now I need to install the start and stop operating lever. This pivot's here, and there's quite a deep shouldered screw. So first of all, I'll lubricate that pivoting point with D5 so that now I can screw it home. So I'm applying a little grease, and this shoulder screw just retains the this little leg on the operating lever. So the idea is when you press the button on the chronograph, this operating lever will pull that pillar wheel round. So with that in place, now I can fit the spring for the return hammer. Naturally, this needs to be lubricated, and once again, you guessed it, I'm using 9501. It's an excellent grease for parts that are under high tension. So the added benefit of this grease is it's very unlikely to spread around the watch. And so with that in place, thus ends part 5 of this 6-part series. So please join me next time and we will conclude this, and as ever, thank you for watching.